Marcus had been away from home for many years. He served as a Marine sniper, a man who carried not just a rifle but the weight of protecting his fellow soldiers. In battle, his eyes were sharp, his mind calm, and his heart steady. He saved lives quietly without boasting, and his record was full of respect. But when he finally came back to his small town, he just wanted peace. He wanted to live quietly, to spend time with his family, and to rebuild his life in ordinary ways. To the people in his neighborhood, Marcus looked like any other man. They didn't know about his medals. They didn't know how many times he had put himself in danger so that others could live. One late afternoon, Marcus was driving home after picking up some supplies from the store. He had on simple clothes, nothing fancy, and his old truck carried groceries for his mother, who was waiting at home. The streets were quiet, but blue flashing lights suddenly lit up behind him. A police car signaled for him to stop. Marcus calmly pulled over, thinking it was just a routine traffic stop. He rolled down the window, polite and respectful, as he had always been taught. The officer walked over and asked for his license. Marcus handed it over without a word. He had nothing to hide, but the officer looked at him with suspicion. Another patrol car pulled up, and now 2 more officers joined. The questions became sharp. "Where are you going?" "What's in the truck?" "Why are you out here this late?" Marcus answered each question honestly, his voice steady. But no matter what he said, it felt like they had already decided not to trust him. One of the officers asked him to step out of the vehicle. Marcus did not argue. He slowly stepped out, keeping his hands visible, just as he had been trained to do in the military. But within moments, one officer pulled out handcuffs. Marcus stood still as the cold metal clicked around his wrists. He was not resisting, yet they treated him like he was a threat. Neighbors peeked from their windows. Some came out onto porches to watch. Whispers spread quickly. What did Marcus do? Nobody asked him directly, but the sight of him in handcuffs was enough to spark doubt. Inside, Marcus felt the sting of humiliation. He had faced enemies on foreign soil, but never thought he would be treated as one in his own hometown. Still, he did not shout or argue. He kept his silence, remembering his discipline. The officers searched his truck, looking through bags of groceries, lifting items carelessly. They found nothing unusual, just bread, milk, canned food, and vegetables. But instead of letting him go, they told him he was being taken in for questioning. The ride to the station was quiet. Marcus looked out the window, thinking of his mother, who would be worried when he didn't return home on time. He thought of the folded flag he kept in his living room, a reminder of the friends he lost in combat. That flag was a symbol of honor, but at that moment he wondered if honor still mattered here. When he arrived at the station, he was placed in a holding room. Hours passed. No one came to explain clearly why he was there. Papers were shuffled outside the door. Voices rose and fell, but Marcus was left in silence. He replayed the scene in his mind again and again. Was it his truck? Was it the neighborhood? Or was it simply the way he looked? Questions filled his thoughts, but answers did not come. By the time he was moved to a cell, his family had heard about it. His younger brother rushed to the police station, demanding to know what had happened. His mother cried at home, sitting by the phone, hoping someone would call with news. To the town, the story quickly spread, twisted by rumor. Some said he was caught doing something suspicious. Others said he had resisted arrest. Few spoke of his quiet nature, his years of service, or the respect he carried in the military. Marcus sat on the hard bench, his head bowed but his spirit unbroken. He thought of his time overseas, the missions where patience meant survival. He reminded himself, stay calm, wait, and the truth will come. Yet the pain of being misunderstood cut deep. He was a Marine sniper, a protector, a man who had risked his life for freedom. And now in his own town, that same freedom felt far away. As night fell, Marcus leaned against the wall of the cell. The sounds of doors clanging, officers laughing in the distance, and the faint hum of the station filled the air. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. Tomorrow he would face the court. Tomorrow he would stand before a judge. He didn't know if anyone there would understand who he really was. But deep in his heart, he believed that truth had a way of finding its way out, even when the world tried to hide it. The first chapter of his struggle was not on the battlefield, but in the very place he had once called home. What began as a simple drive to the store had now turned into a test of his dignity. He had faced enemies before, but this time the battle was different. This time the challenge was to remain strong while the world judged him unfairly. And in the quiet of that cell, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened, he would not let this break him. The next morning arrived, and Marcus was led out of the small holding cell into the bright, echoing hallway of the courthouse. His wrists were still bound in handcuffs, though he walked calmly, without struggle. The officers escorting him didn't speak much. They simply guided him forward as if he were a dangerous man. To Marcus it felt strange. He had marched into battle zones with honor, but here he was being marched into court as if he were the enemy. He kept his head up, his posture straight, the same way he did during inspection in the Marines. When he entered the courtroom, the scene was heavy with whispers. People from the town had shown up, curious to see what was happening. They filled the benches on both sides, some craning their necks to get a better look at him. To many, he was just the quiet man who lived with his mother, fixing things around the house, keeping mostly to himself. Few knew his history. Few understood the weight of the uniform he once wore. Now, instead of medals on his chest, the first thing they saw were cold metal cuffs around his wrists. His mother sat in the back row, her hands folded tightly, eyes glistening with worry. She had dressed in her Sunday best, as if her appearance could somehow remind the court that her son was a man of honor. His younger brother sat beside her, restless, tapping his foot against the wooden floor. The boy had always admired Marcus, had always told friends that his brother was a Marine sniper who could hit a target from a mile away. Now that same brother was sitting quietly, watching strangers treat Marcus as if none of that mattered. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood. Marcus followed the motions, respectful as always. Once everyone was seated again, the clerk read out the charges. The words felt heavy in the air, resisting suspicious activity and other terms that painted Marcus as someone he was not. Marcus listened without expression, though inside he felt each word strike like a blow. He had fought for freedom, yet now he was being described as if he had tried to disrupt peace. The prosecutor began to speak, presenting the police report as fact. He described how Marcus had been uncooperative, how his answers had raised suspicion, and how officers had acted in safety. Each statement twisted the truth into something unrecognizable. Marcus had not shouted, not resisted, not even raised his voice. But on paper it was written as if he had been a threat. People in the audience shook their heads, some whispering to one another. Marcus's lawyer, a public defender assigned to him, did his best. He argued that there had been no real cause for arrest, that Marcus had answered all questions politely, and that nothing illegal had been found in his truck. But the lawyer's words seemed small compared to the prosecutor's confident tone. The officers sitting near the front nodded along with each statement that painted Marcus in the worst light. Marcus stood quietly, saying nothing unless he was asked. When the judge asked for his side, Marcus spoke calmly. He told the court that he had been returning from the store, that he had cooperated, and that his groceries had been searched. His voice carried no anger, only truth, but he noticed how some people seemed not to hear him, as if his calmness worked against him. They expected either outrage or guilt, but Marcus offered neither. He gave them discipline, the same discipline that had carried him through long missions overseas. In the back row, a few veterans had arrived. Word had traveled quickly through the community of those who once served. A retired sergeant whispered to another, shaking his head at what he was witnessing. They knew Marcus. They had trained with him years ago. They knew his record, his skill, and his honor. Yet here in this courtroom it seemed none of that history carried weight. They sat silently waiting, unsure if their presence would be enough to make a difference. Marcus's thoughts drifted as the courtroom carried on with its motions. He remembered his time in the desert, lying still in the sand, waiting for the right moment to act. Patience was his greatest strength then, and he leaned on it now. He knew battles were not always won with loud words or fast actions. Sometimes they were won by waiting for the right moment. So he stayed still, listening, observing, and letting the storm pass over him. Still, the sting of unfairness burned in his chest. To be described as a problem when he had lived his life with discipline felt like a betrayal. He thought of his fallen brothers, the Marines who never made it home, and wondered what they would think of this. Would they shake their heads in disbelief? Would they tell him to stand firm? Marcus believed they would remind him that honor wasn't about what others said. It was about how he carried himself, even when the world misunderstood him. The judge called for a short recess. People stretched, whispered, and walked outside for air. Marcus was guided to a corner of the room, still in cuffs, watched carefully by two officers. His lawyer leaned over and whispered that things didn't look promising, but they should stay hopeful. Marcus simply nodded. He had heard those words before in another context. On missions, hope was not just a word, it was the air you breathed when everything seemed impossible. When the court resumed, tension filled the air. The officers repeated their version of events, their voices firm, their eyes confident. Marcus's lawyer raised objections, but the judge allowed most of the testimony. Marcus remained quiet, only speaking when asked to confirm simple details. His mother wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, her heart breaking with each passing minute. By the end of the session, it looked as if the case was moving against Marcus. The weight of false words, the power of official reports, and the silence of those who didn't yet know his truth pressed heavily on him. He was led out of the courtroom for the day, escorted back toward holding. The crowd outside whispered again, some shaking their heads in doubt, others murmuring in confusion. But in the distance, something was already shifting. Phone calls had been made. Messages had reached people far beyond the town. Men of higher rank, men who knew Marcus's true story, were already preparing to come forward. The storm had only begun, but Marcus did not yet know that soon. The walls of that courtroom would witness something few had ever seen before, a moment when truth would walk in through the very doors where doubt had entered. For now, though Marcus kept his silence, his patience, and his faith that the truth always found a way to rise. The next day, Marcus was brought back into the courtroom. The same heavy chains of silence seemed to hang in the air. People filled the seats again, curious to see what would happen next. For many, it had become less about justice and more about entertainment, as though Marcus's struggle were a performance for them to watch. Some whispered rumors. Others looked at him with suspicion, and a few, especially the veterans who knew his story, carried quiet respect in their eyes. Marcus walked with steady steps, his shoulders squared, his eyes fixed forward. Though he wore no uniform, his discipline showed in every movement. Even in handcuffs, he seemed more dignified than the men who guarded him. His calmness unsettled some people, because it did not match the picture of guilt the officers had painted. He did not look broken, nor did he beg for pity. He looked like a man who had faced greater battles than this. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. Once seated again, the session resumed. The prosecutor spoke first, repeating the same lines from the day before, adding weight to the officers' reports. He painted Marcus as someone dangerous, a man who did not follow orders. Each word was sharp, as though meant to cut down Marcus's honor further. Marcus's lawyer tried to counter, but his words seemed small in comparison. The lawyer lacked the commanding presence needed to turn the room. He pointed out again that no crime had been committed, that Marcus had been polite and cooperative, and that his truck carried nothing but groceries. Yet the tone of the courtroom suggested that truth was not enough. Marcus could see it in the judge's eyes, in the way the audience shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. As Marcus stood before the court, something strange happened. The large wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened slowly. At first, no one paid much attention. People assumed it was just another latecomer. But then a hush began to fall across the room. Heads turned, eyes widened, and even the judge paused mid-sentence. Through the doors stepped a man in full military dress uniform. His chest carried rows of ribbons and medals. His shoulders bore 4 gleaming stars, and his presence filled the entire room with unspoken authority. It was a 4-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the nation. The room went still. Conversations died instantly. Even the officers who had testified against Marcus froze where they sat. The general walked with measured steps, his boots clicking against the polished floor. His face was stern but calm, his eyes sharp as if they had seen far too much of life's battles to be distracted by small matters. Without asking permission, he moved straight to the front of the courtroom. The judge blinked in surprise, unsure whether to interrupt, but even he could not ignore the weight of this man's presence. Everyone watched in silence as the general stopped just a few feet from Marcus. The Marine sniper who had been treated as a criminal now stood face to face with a man who represented the very top of the military command. For a moment, the room held its breath. The general turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said in a deep, steady voice that carried across the courtroom, Before this proceeding continues, I must speak. His tone was not a request. It was a statement. The judge, caught off guard, nodded slowly. The general then addressed the entire room. He introduced himself formally, stating his rank and position. The audience shifted in their seats, realizing this was not just any visitor. This was a man who had commanded thousands, who had stood in the war rooms where decisions shaped history. And now, here he was in a small-town courtroom, speaking on behalf of one man in handcuffs. He turned toward Marcus and began to speak about him. "This man," the general said firmly, pointing to Marcus, "is not who you think he is. He is not a criminal. He is not a threat. He is one of the most skilled Marine snipers this country has ever produced. He has served in places most of you cannot imagine. He has saved lives, not just once, but many times over." The general paused, letting his words sink in. "I have read his file. I know his missions. I know his sacrifices. While many slept safely in their beds, this man was out there protecting them, ensuring they had that safety. And today, he stands here in chains, accused of nothing more than being who he is." Gasps spread across the room. People looked at each other, stunned. Even those who doubted Marcus now found themselves questioning everything they had believed. His mother wept quietly in the back row, her heart swelling with both pride and relief. His younger brother sat taller, his eyes shining with admiration. The general continued, sharing details that no one in the room had ever heard. He spoke of a mission where Marcus's steady hand had saved an entire platoon from an ambush. He described another time when Marcus had volunteered for the most dangerous position, knowing it might cost him his life. He explained how Marcus's name was spoken with respect among soldiers who understood what sacrifice truly meant. Then, in a moment that no one could have predicted, the general turned to Marcus directly. He removed his cap, stood at full attention, and gave Marcus a sharp salute. The room fell silent, every person holding their breath. A 4-star general saluting a man in handcuffs. It was a sight that shook everyone present. And then, to make the moment even more powerful, the general spoke again. "Marcus," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I came here today not just to defend you but to apologize. On behalf of the military, on behalf of the nation, I apologize that a man of your courage and honor has been treated this way. You deserve respect, not suspicion. You deserve gratitude, not chains." The courtroom was stunned. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confidence melting into shame. The prosecutor lowered his papers, suddenly unsure of his position. Even the judge looked unsettled, as if the weight of truth had landed squarely on his shoulders. Marcus remained still, his eyes steady, his face calm. He had not expected this. He had faced enemies in silence, but he had not imagined a 4-star general would walk into a small-town courtroom to defend his name. The moment was overwhelming, yet he carried it with the same dignity he had carried all his life. The audience was no longer whispering. They were silent, waiting, realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The story was no longer about suspicion or charges. It was about truth being revealed in the most powerful way possible. And in that moment, Marcus knew the tide had begun to turn. What started as humiliation was now shifting into honor. The walls of the courtroom, once filled with doubt, now echoed with respect. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since his arrest, Marcus felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. The general remained at the front of the courtroom, his presence unshakable. The story of Marcus was no longer hidden. It was now spoken openly, and nothing could silence it again. The courtroom had never felt so heavy, yet so alive at the same time. Every person sat frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. A 4-star general had stood in front of everyone, saluted Marcus, and offered words that no one expected to hear. It wasn't just a speech. It was truth spoken with the kind of weight that no prosecutor, no officer, and no rumor could challenge. Marcus stood silently, his wrists still in cuffs, his posture strong but calm. For years he had been used to waiting quietly, blending into shadows, doing his duty without recognition. But now the spotlight was on him. The general's presence had pulled him out of the shadows, and people were seeing him for who he truly was. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His gavel rested on the desk, untouched, as though even he knew this was not a moment he could control with wooden taps. He cleared his throat and tried to bring order back. "General," he said, We appreciate your words, but this is a courtroom. Evidence must be presented formally. The general turned to him, calm but firm. Your Honor, I am evidence. My testimony is not based on rumor or assumption. I stand here because I know this man. His record is flawless. His service is decorated. His name carries honor. If this court questions his character, then it must question the very foundation of those who serve this country. The words struck hard. The room grew still again. The officers who had handcuffed Marcus sat rigid, avoiding eye contact. They had thought they were dealing with just another civilian. Now they realized they had placed chains on a man who had defended them long before they even knew his name. The prosecutor tried to regain control. Your Honor, he said nervously, with respect, the presence of a general does not erase the charges. The officers acted according to procedure. Suspicious behavior was noted and resistance was documented. The general's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger but with the sharpness of truth. Resistance? He repeated. This man has faced fire and battle and stood his ground without fear. If he chose silence during your questioning, it was not resistance, it was discipline. Do not mistake dignity for defiance. Gasps and murmurs spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face reddened. He shuffled his papers but found no words to respond. For the first time, the balance of the room shifted. It was no longer Marcus versus the system. It was Marcus, backed by truth and authority, standing taller than any accusation. The general then turned back to Marcus. He looked at him not as a superior officer to a soldier, but as a man speaking to another man. You should never have been here, he said, his voice deep and steady. But since you are, let everyone here know the truth. You are not a problem. You are a protector. You are not a danger. You are a defender. And today you will not leave this courtroom as a prisoner. You will leave as the man you have always been, a Marine whose honor is untouchable. Tears filled Marcus's mother's eyes. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering a prayer of thanks. His younger brother sat taller than ever, his pride swelling beyond words. Veterans in the back row nodded firmly, some standing quietly in respect. The judge leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. For a long moment he said nothing. Then with a heavy sigh he addressed the room. The testimony we have just heard changes the weight of these proceedings. I cannot ignore the character and service of this man. The charges against him seem to lack foundation. In light of this, the case must be reconsidered. The officers shifted in their seats, shame written across their faces. One of them glanced at Marcus but quickly looked away, unable to hold his gaze. They had thought their reports would be enough. Now their words seemed small, almost meaningless compared to the truth that had been spoken. Marcus felt the tension ease, though he remained silent. His years in service had taught him never to celebrate too soon. He watched carefully, listening, waiting. The battle was not won until the final word was spoken. The general, however, did not stop. He turned back to the judge once more. Your Honor, I must ask for something greater than dismissal of charges. I ask for recognition. I ask that this man not be remembered in this town for handcuffs, but for honor. Let his story not be one of suspicion, but of service. Let those who see him in the market, in the streets, or in his church see him for who he is. A Marine sniper who gave everything he had for their safety. The room grew emotional. People who had whispered doubts about Marcus now looked ashamed. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet his. Others stared at him with new respect, realizing they had misjudged a man they barely knew. The judge nodded slowly. Your words carry weight, General. They cannot be ignored. This court will act accordingly. At that moment, the general stepped closer to Marcus. The guards looked uncertain, unsure if they should move. But the general raised his hand and with a quiet but commanding tone said, Remove those cuffs. The officers hesitated, glancing toward the judge. The judge gave a slight nod and reluctantly they moved forward. The handcuffs clicked open, falling away from Marcus's wrists. The marks they had left on his skin were faint, but the meaning was deep. He was no longer a man bound in chains, he was free again. As he rubbed his wrists lightly, Marcus looked at the general. Their eyes met and no words were needed. The salute, the apology, and the truth had already said everything. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now felt transformed. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion but filled with awe. Every person there knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Cameras flashed as photographers captured the moment. Within hours, the story would spread far beyond the town. What began as a small-town courtroom case was about to become a national story, a lesson in respect, honor, and the danger of judging without knowing. Marcus's heart was steady. He did not gloat. He did not glare at the officers or the prosecutor. Instead, he simply stood tall, his silence speaking louder than any words could. He was a Marine, and Marines did not seek revenge. They carried dignity. The general placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder and said quietly, "You are not alone. You never were." For the first time since his arrest, Marcus allowed himself to take a deep breath. The battle inside that courtroom had reached its turning point. What came next would change not just his life, but the way others saw men like him. Men whose service was often invisible until someone dared to bring it into the light. The courtroom was still silent, almost as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of what had just happened. Marcus stood tall without the cuffs, his wrists free, his dignity restored in front of everyone who had doubted him. But more than freedom, he felt something deeper: vindication. For days, whispers had painted him as a criminal, but now the truth had spoken louder than any rumor. The judge cleared his throat again, but this time his voice carried more humility. "This court," he said slowly, "finds no grounds to continue with these charges. All accusations against Marcus are hereby dismissed." His gavel came down firmly, but it was not the sound of punishment. It was the sound of release. The crowd stirred. Some people gasped, some clapped softly, and others simply bowed their heads in shame. Marcus's mother let out a breath she had been holding for too long. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief, not fear. His younger brother rose to his feet, his chest swelling with pride, as if he himself had been cleared of wrongdoing. Veterans in the back row stood together, saluting Marcus quietly, their respect filling the room with unspoken unity. The prosecutor lowered his head, realizing the case had collapsed. The officers who had once been so confident avoided Marcus's eyes. Their earlier authority was now replaced with guilt. They had been exposed, not through anger, but through truth. Marcus turned slightly to face the crowd. His expression remained calm, but inside, his heart was heavy with many emotions. He wasn't angry. He wasn't triumphant. He simply felt the deep truth of being seen again finally as who he truly was: a Marine, a protector, a man of honor. The general stayed close to Marcus, not as a superior, but as a brother in arms. "Come with me," he said softly. Together they walked toward the back of the courtroom. Every person stood aside, giving them space. No one dared block their path. As Marcus walked past, the same neighbors who once whispered about him now looked at him with new eyes. Respect had replaced doubt. Outside, reporters swarmed. Cameras clicked. Microphones were raised, and questions flew from every direction. "General, why are you here? What do you have to say about Marcus? Will this change how veterans are treated?" The general paused, looked directly into the cameras, and spoke firmly. "This man deserves your respect. He has already given more to his country than you can measure. Let his story remind you never to judge without knowing. Let his life be honored, not questioned." Marcus remained quiet, as he always did. He had never been a man of many words. His silence was powerful enough. He simply walked through the crowd, his head held high, the general's hand still on his shoulder. Back home, the atmosphere was different. His mother hugged him tightly, refusing to let go. His younger brother couldn't stop talking, replaying the moment when the general saluted Marcus. "I'll never forget it," he said proudly. Neighbors who once avoided him now came to the door, some with apologies, some with offerings of food, all trying to make up for their doubt. Marcus accepted their kindness politely, but he did not let bitterness take root. He knew people often feared what they didn't understand. The following days brought change. The story spread across newspapers, television channels, and online platforms. Headlines read, "Marine Sniper Freed After General's Intervention," and "From Handcuffs to Honor, A Veteran's Truth Revealed." Across the country, people read about Marcus and felt the weight of his story. Many began to speak differently about veterans. Many were reminded that behind every quiet man or woman in their neighborhood might be a story of sacrifice they could never fully grasp. Marcus, however, did not seek attention. He returned to his routines. He still drove his old truck, still helped his mother with groceries, still walked the same streets. The only difference was how people looked at him now. Children asked for his stories. Adults greeted him with respect, and even the same officers who had once doubted him now saluted when they crossed paths. But Marcus carried himself the same way as always, with humility. He did not brag about the general's words. He did not replay the courtroom scene for praise. Instead, he chose to live quietly, letting his actions speak as they always had. He believed respect was not about titles or stars, but about how one carried oneself, even in the hardest of times. The general visited him once more before returning to his duties. Sitting in Marcus's small living room, he spoke honestly. What happened in that courtroom was more than about you. It was about every veteran who has ever been misunderstood. You stood silently, and that silence spoke for all of them. You gave them a voice without saying a word. Marcus nodded. I only did what I always do. He replied softly. Wait for the truth. It always comes. The general smiled. And it came because of you. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus found peace. The humiliation he once felt had been replaced with something far stronger. Respect earned not just on the battlefield but at home. His story became a reminder that honor cannot be taken away by chains, that dignity shines even brighter when tested. In the end, Marcus was not remembered as the man in handcuffs. He was remembered as the Marine sniper who carried himself with discipline, who endured unfair judgment without breaking, and who stood tall when the truth was finally revealed. The town never forgot the day the 4-star general walked into their courtroom. But more than that, they never forgot the man who stood silently in chains and walked out free, with honor no one could deny. And for Marcus, life went on. He remained the same man he had always been, humble, quiet, and strong. But now every time he walked through town, people saw not just a man, they saw a hero.